On July 15, 1976, a group of 26 children and their driver, Ed Ray, boarded a school bus to return home after a day of summer classes in Chowchilla, California. What seemed like an ordinary school routine soon turned into an unspeakable nightmare. The bus was hijacked by 3 armed men, and the victims were taken to a remote location where they were to be buried alive. The kidnappers, after forcing the driver and children off the bus, took everyone to an isolated quarry. There, the kidnappers placed them inside an old cargo truck, buried more than 12 meters deep in a deep hole. Without light or adequate ventilation, the absolute darkness and scorching heat made the environment unbearable. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos about real cases and stories of overcoming adversity. This story is unmissable and well worth watching until the end. On July 15, 1976, a mass kidnapping left the entire town of Chowchilla, California, in shock. What seemed like an ordinary day turned into an unprecedented mystery when 26 children and their driver, Ed Ray, mysteriously disappeared. The town soon realized something was very wrong when the school bus, which should have arrived at its final destination, never showed up. There were no signs of where they were, and nobody knew for sure what was happening. The case became even more unsettling because there was no immediate ransom demand. The kidnappers, 3 armed men, had intercepted the bus, forced the children and the driver into vans, and taken them to an unknown location. No witnesses were able to provide clear information about what had happened, and the authorities were without leads. The investigation began with searches of roads and rural areas around Chowchilla, but there were no visible signs indicating where the group had been taken. With each passing hour, the case seemed to grow more mysterious. The kidnappers had been very careful to hide any trace of their actions, further hindering the police investigation. With the group's complete disappearance, the city of Chowchilla was thrown into a state of panic. Parents were desperate, not knowing what had happened to their children. The lack of clues, the absence of a ransom demand, and the fact that the kidnapping involved so many victims made the case even more bizarre and incomprehensible. The national media covered the case, and the search intensified, with helicopters and rescue teams working tirelessly, but without immediate results. The mystery continued to deepen, until, finally, the authorities began to uncover the true location of the victims and what had happened to them. Chowchilla's kidnapping was not just a disappearance, but something far more complex and terrifying. As the search for answers continued, the true extent of the victims' suffering and their courage to survive would be revealed in a surprising way. The Chowchilla kidnappers were 3 seemingly ordinary men from wealthy and respectable California families. Fred Woods, James Schoenfeld, and his brother Richard Schoenfeld had everything many people would want: a good education, social status, and a promising future. However, behind their appearances as successful young men lay a dark motivation that led to one of the most horrific kidnappings in United States history. Fred Woods, the mastermind behind the crime, had a history of problematic behavior. He was a young sociopath, obsessed with money and power. Woods came from a wealthy family, but his actions revealed a disturbed personality. Together with James Schoenfeld, who also had financial problems, they orchestrated the kidnapping as a way to obtain a large sum of money through ransom. They believed that the state of California would be willing to pay millions of dollars to release the children, considering them valuable victims due to their potential ransom price. The psychology of the kidnappers is particularly fascinating, as they were not typical street criminals or individuals with a history of violence. In reality, these men came from privileged families with access to a good education and a comfortable life. This makes their crime even more incomprehensible. Why then did these men, who seemingly had everything, choose to kidnap children? The answer lies in their motivations and how they saw themselves as above the law and social norms. They were in a spiral of financial desperation and saw crime as a solution to their problems, believing they could escape the consequences given their social and financial status. Furthermore, there was a sense of impunity hanging over them. Their social privileges, their upper-class background, and the fact that they had avoided severe punishment in the past, such as when Woods was accused of car theft but escaped with a light sentence, made them feel they could commit this crime without getting caught. They planned the kidnapping for over a year, with meticulous precision, thinking of every detail. The kidnapping of Chowchilla was not merely an extortion attempt, but a reflection of the psychology of these individuals who, despite their seemingly comfortable lives, were willing to resort to extreme violence to satisfy their needs. The true complexity of their criminal minds and the psychological factors that led them to commit such an act remained a mystery to many, but history revealed the depth of desperation and insanity that lay behind such a brutal crime. The Chowchilla kidnapping in 1976 was a profound trauma that affected the lives of the 26 children who were buried alive in a quarry, along with their driver, Ed Ray. The experience of being kidnapped, taken to an unknown location, and held captive for over 12 hours, buried in total darkness, had an emotional impact that echoed throughout the lives of these victims. Even after the miraculous rescue, what they lived through in that underground hole could never be erased. The children, who were mostly just innocent girls and boys, found themselves in an extreme survival situation. They were panicked, not knowing if they would get out of captivity alive. The suffocating heat, the total darkness, and the constant fear that their kidnappers would return to kill them created a devastating psychological scenario. Many of them felt great despair, with terrifying thoughts that they would never see their families again. The lack of air and space to move, in addition to the fear of being buried alive, generated a constant feeling of helplessness and anguish. After their escape and rescue, the struggle for these children was far from over. While they managed to physically escape their underground prison, the psychological trauma remained. The shock and flashbacks of the terrifying hours haunted them for many years. Memories of the darkness, the fear of imminent death, and the sound of their kidnappers, voices continued to haunt their minds. Many of the children found themselves dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, constant nightmares, and the feeling that they were always in danger. The emotional pain was an invisible burden that accompanied them, often heavier than the physical scars left by their captivity. Rebuilding their lives was a long and painful process. Many of them spent years trying to adapt to normal life, struggling to cope with the anxiety and fears that arose after the kidnapping. The support of their families and therapists was crucial, but the experience had scarred them in a way that words could not describe. Some children managed to move on with their lives, but others never fully overcame what they experienced in that quarry. The ghosts of the past continued to haunt them, impacting their relationships, dreams, and even their worldview. The kidnapping of Chowchilla, while a story of courage and survival, is also a story of how violence and trauma affect the human psyche. The children who survived not only fought for their lives in that hole, but also struggled to rebuild their own identity and emotional health after the event. The impact of Chowchilla's kidnapping lasted long after the rescue, a true mark on their lives that would never be erased. After nearly 16 hours buried alive in an underground pit, the rescue of the 26 children and their driver, Ed Ray, seemed impossible. When the kidnappers took them to the isolated quarry and placed them inside a rusty cargo truck buried in a 12-meter deep hole, no one knew for sure how long they would survive. The scorching heat and lack of air made the situation even more desperate. Absolute darkness enveloped the victims, who were trapped without any possibility of escape or help. As the hours ticked by, the hope of rescuing the victims dwindled. Authorities had mobilized quickly to search for clues, but the chances of finding them in time seemed increasingly slim. The children and Ed Ray were alone, fighting against time, fear, and asphyxiation. However, a combination of courage, resilience, and a great deal of luck would begin to change the course of history. Ed Ray, the bus driver, was the first to show leadership and hope in the face of adversity. Knowing that their only chance of survival was to escape the hole, he began working with the children to move the heavy iron cover that blocked the truck's entrance. They pushed, dug, and strained to the limit to force their way to freedom. The psychological pressure was immense, but the collective strength of the children and the driver was the key to their survival. Finally, after hours of exhausting effort, a beam of light pierced the darkness. The joy of seeing sunlight for the first time in so long was a pivotal moment for everyone. But the escape was far from easy. The children and Ed Ray had to climb out of the hole, and the fear that the kidnappers would return still hung in the air. However, the victory of freedom was near. With Ed Ray's help, the children finally managed to escape captivity and run to safety. They were free, but the psychological suffering of the experience would not be so easily overcome. The rescue of Chowchilla was a true miracle. When the authorities finally arrived, the children and the driver had already escaped, but the scene of their heroic escape was one of the most impressive in the history of kidnappings. The survival of these children, amidst such a desperate scenario, became a symbol of strength and resilience in the face of the impossible. Although the psychological trauma was profound, the courage and decisive action of Ed Ray and the children saved their lives and made them true real-life heroines. After the miraculous rescue of the 26 children and their driver, Ed Ray, the Chowchilla kidnapping case was not over. Although the victims had finally escaped the underground terror, the fight for justice was only beginning. The kidnappers, Fred Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers, had left the children and the driver with profound psychological trauma, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. However, the road to their arrest and trial was long and difficult. The investigation began immediately after the rescue, but the kidnappers had been trying to cover their tracks for months. They had planned the kidnapping meticulously, but hadn't counted on the failure of their rescue plan and the victims' reaction. It was only after a detailed investigation, with the help of witnesses and security evidence, that the kidnappers were identified. Fred Woods, the group's leader, and the Schoenfeld brothers, James and Richard, were arrested and brought to justice. The arrest of 3 men who appeared to live ordinary lives, coming from wealthy families, shocked society even more. How was it possible that seemingly successful people could be involved in such a brutal crime? The psychology behind this crime proved to be more complex than imagined, and the kidnappers were thoroughly investigated to understand their motivations. Although the kidnapping was motivated by financial issues, there was also a clear lack of empathy and a distorted view of reality on the part of the kidnappers. The trial was harrowing, especially for the victims, who were forced to relive the nightmare. The children, now teenagers, had to testify against the men who had held them prisoner. Buried alive in a hole, the emotional impact of reliving the moments of panic and despair was immense. The courtroom became a place of confrontation, where the survivors not only sought justice but also tried to find some kind of closure for the pain they had endured. Fred Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers were sentenced to long prison terms for their crimes, but justice was not simple. Beyond the legal punishment, the emotional impact on the victims and their families was profound. The feeling that justice had been served was only part of the healing process, but the psychological trauma and suffering that accompanied the children during and after the trial did not disappear. The Chowchilla case became a landmark in United States history, not only because it was one of the largest mass kidnappings, but also because of the victims' courage and the lengthy legal process that sought to ensure the kidnappers paid for their actions. The impact of their actions was lasting, but in the end, the victims achieved justice, and the kidnappers faced the consequences of their crime. The kidnapping of Chowchilla left deep scars on the lives of the 26 children and their driver, Ed Ray. Although the rescue was a miracle, the victims' emotional journey was far from over. Following the event, many of the survivors faced years of pain, anxiety, and struggles to cope with the psychological trauma they carried. The experience of being buried alive, separated from their families, and forced to fight for their own survival, altered their lives forever. However, over time, many of the survivors began to tread the difficult path of recovery and forgiveness. The emotional trauma of being kidnapped and buried alive was immense. The children lived with nightmares, irrational fears, and difficulty trusting those around them. The psychological impact was often more lasting than the physical wounds, affecting their relationships, their studies, and their ability to move on with their lives. Adapting to normal life seemed impossible for many Tao, who still carried the ghosts of the kidnapping even years after their rescue. However, over the years, many survivors began to seek ways to heal their wounds. The process of overcoming was long, but some found strength in their families, friends, and especially in psychological support. For some, recovery involved rebuilding a sense of security and learning to live again without the constant weight of fear. But for others, there was a deeper journey of forgiveness, not only towards their kidnappers, but towards themselves. The process of accepting what they had experienced and beginning to forgive was crucial to their emotional well-being. Forgiveness was not easy. Anger and resentment toward the kidnappers were natural and understandable. But many survivors came to the conclusion that forgiveness was necessary for their own healing. Forgiving the men who had buried them alive did not mean forgetting what happened, but rather releasing the emotional weight that this hatred caused in their own lives. For some victims, Forgiveness was a vital step toward regaining control of their own stories and living without the constant domination of trauma. The journey of overcoming adversity for the children of Chowchilla is a story of resilience and strength. Despite everything they went through, they managed to rebuild their lives. Some pursued successful careers, others became advocates for mental health issues, and all found ways to move forward. Their forgiveness, healing, and resilience are powerful testimonies that, although the past cannot be erased, it is possible to rebuild life, transform pain into strength, and live with purpose, even after such devastating trauma. Following the Chowchilla kidnapping, the legal process continued for many years, and parole hearings became a constant part of the survivors' lives. Even after Fred Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers were convicted and sent to prison, the survivors found themselves facing their kidnappers again, now within the prison walls. These parole hearings were painful and challenging as they brought back the trauma, fears, and memories of the nightmare they had lived through. Each time one of the kidnappers was eligible for parole, the survivors had to relive the horror to ensure that justice was served and that their kidnappers remained behind bars. For many survivors, the idea of having to face their kidnappers in a courtroom was an immense psychological challenge. The emotional trauma of being kidnapped and buried alive did not fade with time. Each time the kidnappers appeared before the court, the victims were forced to revisit the darkest moments of their lives. The hearings became a constant reminder of the violence they had suffered, but also an opportunity to ensure that the kidnappers were not released, so that no one else would go through what they had. The victims, now adults, gathered to testify against their kidnappers at each hearing, describing in detail what they had experienced and how it still impacted their lives. These testimonies were filled with emotion and pain, as each survivor had their own scars and stories to tell. Their words were not only a plea for justice, but also a cry of resistance against the kidnappers and the pain they had caused. The parole process also served to remind the survivors of what they had lost. Although they had physically survived the kidnapping, the life they had before the trauma could never be recovered. The parole hearings were moments of confrontation, where fear and anger were mixed with the hope that the kidnappers would never get out of prison again. Fred Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers faced numerous hearings over the years, with some ultimately being considered for parole. For the survivors, this was a constant reminder that the fight for justice and inner peace would never end, as long as the kidnappers still had the possibility of leaving prison. Although legal justice had been served, true justice, however, would be a process that would continue to last throughout the survivors' lives. The Chowchilla kidnapping, which occurred in 1976, was not only one of the most shocking crimes in United States history, but also a significant landmark for child safety in the country. Following the kidnapping and the suffering endured by the 26 children and their driver, Ed Ray, the case forced authorities to rethink and implement new safety measures to protect children throughout the United States. The impact of the kidnapping was profound and transformative, resulting in changes in how schools, school transportation, and authorities address child safety to this day. Before the Chowchilla kidnapping, school transportation systems were simpler and less regulated. Children often traveled without any additional safety measures, and many schools lacked clear protocols for handling emergencies. After the kidnapping, it was clear that the system needed immediate and comprehensive reforms to ensure that something so terrifying never happened again. The Chowchilla incident led to a significant increase in child supervision, driver training, and a review of safety procedures for school transportation. One of the most important changes was the implementation of safety and communication devices on school buses. New regulations required school bus drivers to be equipped with communication devices to report incidents immediately. In addition, schools began reviewing their safety procedures and working more closely with local authorities to create action plans should similar situations occur. Awareness of child safety also increased throughout society, leading to prevention campaigns and greater collaboration between schools and safety agencies. Furthermore, the Chowchilla kidnapping also had an impact on the justice system, with a renewed focus on child protection as a priority in kidnapping cases. Child safety laws were revised and strengthened, guaranteeing harsher penalties for criminals involved in crimes against minors and increased oversight in kidnapping cases. The Chowchilla case, in its tragedy, helped accelerate the creation of protocols that now protect children in schools and school buses more effectively. Chowchilla's legacy is still visible today in many aspects of school safety. The case not only shaped safety policies for school transportation, but also inspired a culture of greater vigilance and accountability to ensure the protection of children across the country. Despite the pain and trauma the victims experienced, their suffering helped prevent future crimes and save lives, transforming the child safety system in the United States. Even after their escape and rescue, the Chowchilla children were not free from the consequences of their kidnapping. The terror they experienced during the nearly 16 hours they were buried alive in a quarry left deep scars on their lives. The emotional impact was devastating, and many of the survivors struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and constant anxiety. Life after the rescue would never be the same. The psychological trauma of being kidnapped, buried alive, and held captive affected each of the victims in different ways, but all shared the weight of the experience. The children struggled to sleep without light, a direct symptom of the absolute fear they felt while being buried in darkness. Recurring nightmares about the kidnapping and the constant fear of being in danger again were common. Furthermore, many of the victims felt a loss of control over their lives, something that before the kidnapping seemed so certain and secure. Social stigma also became a challenge. Despite the courage of these children in surviving and coping with the trauma, they came to be seen not only as victims, but as symbols of a brutal crime. This often caused social isolation, as some people could not understand the depth of the trauma the children were facing. The support of the community, families, and mental health professionals was fundamental in helping these young people reintegrate into society and overcome the psychological barriers that the kidnapping had created. For many of these children, the journey to recovery was long and full of obstacles. Some dealt with the trauma in isolation, while others sought psychological help and support from survivor groups. The process of healing emotional wounds was not linear, and the suffering persisted for years. The pain of the kidnapping never completely disappeared, but over time, many survivors managed to find ways to rebuild their lives. They began to live again, to form families, pursue careers, and fight for causes that helped them find purpose in their experiences. Chowchilla's story, however, is not just about trauma and pain, but also about the resilience and strength of children who, despite the terror they faced, managed to overcome one of the greatest horrors in U.S. history. The emotional and psychological scars remain, but these children's lives went on. They prove that even when the pain seems unbearable, the will to live and hope can prevail.